So we are now live in our 7th session, Technology as Active Agent with Magno Caliman.
Yay. Okay, so let me open this up here.
I did not hear the scary warning about live.
That scary warning comes earlier, and then I have to turn it on the YouTube side.
Oh, okay.
So now we are certainly live.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
So should I start or?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, well, thanks again for being here at another session of the quarantine seminars. This is the 7th one, and today's guest is Magno. I don't have a text written for Magno, but I'll try to improvise sort of an introductory remark. As usual, everything I say is a mix of notes on what these people have been doing artistically or technically or whatever. It's a mix between that and more ideas collected in the quotidian, because most of the people who appear here as guests for the quarantine seminars, we've been able, usually I tell Mike that I've been very lucky to know these people. These people have somehow been or are still a part of for me. And Magno is one of these very special cases. I met Magno, like, I would say probably 12 years ago. He used to, I guess it's 12 to 13, I would say. Yeah. He used to go around on the classes at the university, and we had the opportunity to share ideas and hear some music together, make some music together. And in one of these first opportunities, I had this opportunity to. It was a long time ago, right? To conduct one of the premiere of one of his pieces, whose title is like into my opinion, a terrible pun involving the name of a composer, Ligeti, and a very specific expression in Brazil. The name of the piece, for those who can speak Portuguese, and I would not be able to translate that, is Se Ligeti. To me, a terrible name, and I remember thinking at the time, okay, this is great actually. But I remember thinking at the time, oh, this guy has the weirdest sense of humor. Well, I would say I have proper confirmation of that. I believe this idea of him, this sense of humor of his, is an integral part of most of what he does. There is this irreverence, I would say, which is, and that is why I chose to begin from this point. I would say this irreverence is sort of, I don't know if he would put it like that, but it's sort of a way of life for him. I can see this kind of detachment shared with his activities as a teacher, for instance. I would say he had a major part for some of the musical scenes going on in Rio de Janeiro right now. He had a position at Parque Lage as a teacher for arts and technologies, whatever that idea exactly means. And one of the things he would defend, and I would say he keeps defending this, actually, this is a major point for what he does today, is that you should not be consider technology to be something as if you are an artist, to be something which you would pay any kind of reverence to. You should just go there and pick the object, I would say, whatever it is. It could be an algorithm that you just found on the internet, this idea of the algorithm as a found object as well. And you should just look at this object and say, okay, I don't understand it right now. Let's see what I can do in the next few days with it. And he would start to explore, like without any morals, I would say. And at the end of a week, he would have a piece for him to perform such a strong piece as the Screen Bashing, which is one of my favorites. So I would say this sense of humor and this kind of irreverence, which follows Magno wherever he goes, he and his sandals and his torn trousers. I would say this is a major part of what he does. He gained a huge respect from people who were around him during his classes in Parque Lage. I could witness that because one of the projects which I run at the university, I received many people who already studied with Magno, and like I would say the most of the people who went to this project, to Fábrica de Sons Eletrônicos, studied with Magno, and they had incredible things to say about him. Well, at the end of all these years, this guy with this weird humor, fantastic ideas and pieces and amazing life experiences, he came to be to share the apartment with me. And again, this irreverence of his, which is, I would say, one of the most incredible things about him, would make me knock at his door every once in a while when I was kind of just tired from the day, and say to him, okay, let's grab a beer. And he would say, okay, let's just go down and grab a beer and talk about everything, about politics. I would say that he was still in Brazil during this rise of whatever is rising now in Brazil. This rise began, he was still here, and his irreverence told me and still tells me that, okay, I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow, but let's grab a beer now, let's talk about it, and let's solve it as the days come, which is the opposite of me. And I really thank him for these fantastic lessons, which I try to live, but I feel I still fail every time. Mm-hmm. But Magno is an example of I would say positive and productive irreverence, and as a survival. So that's it. So this is Magno.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. That's I was looking forward to, because the Paulo Danta's introduction has become a staple of these events, like the summary of a person in 5 to 7 minutes, and it's but I didn't expect it to hear about Siligeti, but it makes sense. It makes sense, and you're
Everything was already there, I would say.
yeah. Yeah, and while you were talking about the that I was there when there was the rising happening of whatever it is that's rising in politics in Brazil, I just invented the title of a piece for you to think about. So it's the shepherd tone of Brazilian politics. But whatever it is that is rising has been rising forever, and it's not going to stop, and it looks like it's not going to stop. But said that, what I wanted to do was to, and that's a little bit on the text on Facebook, and then it's has been touched upon a little bit while in some of the stuff that Paulo said, was to talk about art and technology. So if there was a broad concept, a broad theme here, that would be it. And just to, like, as a brief introduction, of course, Paulo and you all know me very well already. Michael knows me a little bit, but Luca and Martin, I think, know me that well. But just to give a little bit of context, so I studied in Rio, where Paulo is now. I went to the music composition school in the University of Rio de Janeiro, where Paulo used to teach, and then he went to another one, but where he studied also. So I went to a very traditional music composition school, which is the way that the University of Rio works. It's this, it's basically an European conservatory shoved into a public university, and everything that comes with that. And then I did a master's degree in Unirio, which is the other university in Rio de Janeiro, where I got a master's in education. So for this, and that's where, like, I've been teaching technology-related subjects, let's call, in the arts for a while now, but specifically and that's the context that Paulo mentioned, where there's this school in Rio called the Parque Lage Visual Arts School. It's a very traditional school from the 70s. And it's there that I had a few courses related to art and technology, where I actually, like Paulo said, had a few students. There are people from the experimental music scene in Rio right now. And the only reason that I'm bringing this is because a lot of what I think I'm going to talk about today connects to that, which is seeing how artists deal with technology as an entity that mediates, that makes a mediation of their creative practices. So for my master's specifically, Paulo dropped. So for my master's specifically, what I studied is how do artists learn specifically programming at the time. There was a broader subject of how artists learn technology, but specifically for my master's degree, for my master's diploma, what I studied is how do you learn and how do you teach programming as an artist. So you're someone that comes from the visual arts or from music, and all of a sudden you're having to deal with things like object orientation and somehow someone tells you, well, this is a thing that you use to make art. So that was, and again, the only reason that I'm bringing this, that I had a lot of students in this, is because looking at how they learn those things and how they use those entities, those objects that, like Paulo said, could be either an algorithm, a computational object, or electronic circuit. So those are the two main objects that I'm going to talk about today. Seeing how all those students deal with that basically became my my master's research from the standpoint of education for my master's, and it still has a lot of influence in what I'm hoping to do as a PhD student, but not from the standpoint of education, but from the standpoint of actual creative practices. So, and this also is important to say, like the text that I send, the quote unquote article that I send, it's actually part of a PhD application that I sent, which is that I sent to a university here in Europe, the Orpheus Institute in Belgium, which deals with this topic of, well, we are artists, and there are some artistic practices that have technology, that have technical objects, that have these entities as mediators of our practice, of our processes. Specifically, I'm going to talk about programming and electronics. So we are artists, and we're using those things to make art. What happens now? What happens? What's the consequences of that for the object itself and for the process the artist goes through once the thing you're engaging with in your practice, for example, is not a harmonic process, a motive way of working with a melody that you learn in school, but all of a sudden the object that you're interacting with is an electronic component called a transistor that you're not 100% sure how it works. Or is this piece of code that, like Paulo said, I'm not 100% sure how it works. I very much liked what he said, this idea of the algorithm as a found object. You go onto Stack Overflow and you copy something and you paste it and it works. How do you deal with that? So for that, what I wanted to do was just, giving this brief, not so brief introduction, I wanted to show some pieces that I have, that I did, in specifically 3 pieces that I think touch on those subjects a little bit, each one in a different way. And then I wanted to read with you guys, especially because it's not 50 people, it's like 5 besides me, so we can have a very informal, a very relaxed conversation about this piece of article that I wrote. Make a sort of commentary, commented reading with you guys for like the first and second page, because again, I'm really interested in knowing other people's opinions about what I wrote, simply because, like I said, this is the application for a PhD project that I'm gonna have to defend in a month to see if I actually enter the university. I haven't entered yet, so I'm using this opportunity as a sort of, you guys are like my guinea pig, non-judgmental, panel of evaluation for this application. So yeah, but first I wanted to show some pieces that I think deal with that in a way. So most of my practice for the last, I don't know, several years, ever since Seligeti, like Paulo mentioned, which actually, to be honest, I consider to be my first composed piece, actually. Before that, and I think I wrote that probably around like 2009 or 8 or something. So already like 4 years after I entered composition school. But all the way up until that point, it was just, meaningless exercises of write this dodecaphonic piece, because that's what we're studying this semester. And even then, I would try to make the best of it, like writing a baião dodecafônico, and the professor would say that I was cheating, but if Alban Berg can do it, so can I. But anyway, what I've been doing for my practice for several years now mainly revolves around those 2 entities. Somehow programming, so taking programming languages as places for creative inquiry, and electronics, and those 2 things come together very well in some aspects. So the pieces that I wanted to show two of them are live coding pieces. One is a purely software live coding, which is screen bashing, the one that Paulo mentioned. Another one called SquareFuck. It's also a live coding piece, but it's an Arduino live coding piece, so it sits very well in this middle ground between software and electronics. And the third one is actually a series of pieces called Transcription, which was actually it's not a piece, it's like as in a music piece, but it's a series of objects that I constructed for an exhibition, like an art exhibition that I did in the Netherlands, part of an art residency. So the first one that I want to show, then there's no special order. Let's do screen bashing, and let's start from software, then middle ground, and some things that are purely hardware. So screen bashing is like I said, live coding piece. And I think the best way for me to show, because the link is on Vimeo, is to share my screen, because then you guys can hear it also. So my entire screen, okay. Just so you guys don't have a headless voice from above talking to you guys, let's do it like this. There you go. Okay, so screen bashing is, where is the folder? There it is. Well, I'm gonna show a little bit of it, and then we'll talk. Let's see what you guys think. Is this the right thing? Yes, it is. Okay. I'm gonna skip to the part that has sound just to make sure that you guys can hear. You can hear, right?
Yeah, super well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let me go back then. skip a little bit ahead to the almost end. Okay. And just to make sure, can you say something just to make sure that I can still hear you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We hear
So,
you and you hear us.
Yes.
So like I said, this piece is a live coding piece. That means that I'm changing the code in real time. So I think what's interesting and relates to the discussion here is that it's a piece that I'm going to use what this analogy that Paulo said of the algorithm as a found object, and taking it and running with it, even though you are not sure how it works. The way that this works is that right at the beginning, it's a very simple. This part here, actually it's better to, let's actually show it. Use it on, yeah, since Emacs is open, let's go with that. But this is the code that generates the whole this is the code that generates the whole visual part, which is basically, even though it looks complicated, if you've never seen, for example, C code before, it's just a whole bunch of characters being printed on the screen, printed as in being shown on the screen. And now what I think again, how this relates to the discussion here is that this came to be in a way in a time where I was trying to study a little bit of C, like of the C programming language, right? And the way that you do with any programming language, you start reading tutorials and going online, and you have your first Hello World lesson, which is basically just having a line of text printed to the screen saying Hello World. And of course, that happened with the materials that I was looking through. And this is something that I think it's worth a discussion, because if you're an engineer, and that was a big part of my master's, like one of the main conclusions and the way that I devised all my methodology for teaching programming. So if you think of an engineer that is learning to program and you are faced with that situation, okay, this is how you start learning. Type hello world on the screen, type print hello world, go to lesson 2, just to make sure that everything is working. The relationship that, and better yet, the use case that an artist has with a programming language and the use case that an engineer has with a programming language, they're so far apart in some aspects that this example shows how you can use exactly the same, let's call it the same beginning system to achieve two completely different results. So if you're an artist, your main goal at some point is to take that object and make a piece or make an art object with it. So if you have that, almost like a plastic object in your face, which is, well, this is it. I learned how to print a line on the screen. As an artist, you're in a position where you can interrogate that object in terms of what can I do with it? What are its poietic potentialities? So there's a potential in this object that I found. You know, I don't understand what the hell compiling means, but I know I have to do it with the language. I have no idea why do I have to put this stdio.h. I've never seen a .h file in my life. I don't know what return 0 means at the end, but I know that I have this thing right here in front of me that allows me to print stuff on the screen. And somehow to interrogate that entity, this object, this, in this case, computational object, in those terms, as in what are its potentialities? So you think potentiality in almost as in a physical sense, something that is latent, that it's not instantiated yet. There's a potential in it. So what are the potentials that exist in this object that allows me to somehow, if you're thinking in a plastic sense, to stretch it over and to turn it into something that I can use to make art with? And just the very briefly explained mindset is so distinct from the way that a programmer, you know, a professional programmer or an engineer approaches the same object. You know, imagine how a professional engineer approaches this same object that I'm showing. He's probably gonna say, well, this is one of the shittiest pieces of code that I've ever seen because it overloads the CPU into like 99% in 10 minutes. You're using this function here that you're not supposed to use it. Your code is actually full of errors because when you compile it, there's a whole bunch of warnings on the screen. So if I compile this, this is on the, you know what, let me put this on the desktop. It's going to be faster. Well, it's not going to be faster. Let me see. This is Dropbox, minhas tralhas, composições, screen bashing. What is it called? Screen bashing.c, right? C. Let's see. Foo. I haven't done this in a while. I think the order is wrong. Okay, it's yeah, the output is supposed to be here. So it's this with the output foo. There's no screen bashing.c. Oh, because I don't know how to type. Why can't I? Well, if I were to compile, I'll just show it on the video then. Yeah, here. So there's like a whole bunch of warnings on the screen saying, well, you're using implicit conversion from a type double to a type int. There's an implicit declaration that is from the system function that is invalid in C99, which I have no idea what it is. Well, I didn't know at the time, but I researched it. There's a how do you say de propósito? There's a intentional typo here that generates an extra warning. So it's completely different from the use case that an engineer would use. And my point here is, we as an artist, we're in a position where that is our practice. We can approach the same object with a completely different, our use case is so different that we can approach the same object in a completely different way. So in this piece, this is exacerbated and turned into a directive, into a way of working, which is, well, all right, so there are limitations that this object is imposing in here. Like the CPU gets maxed out, I'm not going to show the super collider code, but it's basically a one-liner that has no parameters that I can control. My only option is to superimpose different versions and different layers of the same code. So I'm going to take all of those things and turn them into the main directive of the piece. So in the end, what you have is this that you see here, which is just a jumbled mess of code, of terminal windows. And the computer CPU is being completely driven to oblivion because I cannot control anything anymore. So I just create terminal window over terminal window over terminal window until I cannot control the computer. And for this version, which is in this video, I didn't know how to end the piece at the time because basically the computer becomes totally unresponsive. So for this version, which was, I think it's from the Incun 2015, yeah, the Encontro Nacional de Compositores, the National Composers Encontro in São Paulo, the way that I used to end it was just to, force quit all the terminal windows and literally call it quits. That's how it ends. That's okay. But for the current versions, I came up with another way of ending the piece, which I like a lot more, which is just playing until the computer battery dies. So I enter the stage with a certain amount of battery percentage that I know that makes the piece last for the amount of time that I want, like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And then it ends with something like, I think I have a video of that. Oops, let me see. Fuba. Yeah, so I just play until the computer battery dies and the piece ends like this. And then you get like the projector overlay of it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that's like the technicalities, because I know that people want to know sometimes, what's the language that you're using and how do you write it and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm very interested in a piece like this, for example, is this idea, like I said, on the small text that I sent to the Facebook event, is this idea of mediation. And on top of the idea of mediation, the idea that the technology that you're using is an active agent. So the entity that is literally between you, the artist, who is for some reason decided that you want to go into this endeavor of, inquiring an object to make art with it, which is in itself a reason to ask why we do that. But if you somehow decided to do that, between you, the artist, and that impetus of doing that, and the final object that exists in the world, as in this is the piece, literally, sometimes literally, in the middle of the way, there's technology that is mediating that process. And here I talk about mediation as almost as in a synonym with negotiating an exchange. So I'm trying to propose that technology is this almost entity that is negotiating, that is controlling the negotiation between you, the artist, and the object. But that and that is my argument, that in that process of negotiating the exchange, the negotiator is not it takes sides. The negotiator takes sides. It's not a neutral entity. And in that piece, for example, that's completely obvious in some aspects. Like I said, the code that I was using just completely overflow my CPU to the point where it was barely non-usable in a non-artistic way. For example, let's keep it at that. So there was something that is intrinsic to the object that I was using that I could not get rid of, or maybe I could. An engineer would say, well, instead of writing those 8 lines, you could have written this 38-line object that would solve that problem, or doing better memory allocation. Or I'm sure people solve that problem because computers don't explode when you use them on a daily basis. But I could use it without solving that problem. That's the main one of the main points. So this object that I was using was saying to me, well, this is how I present myself to you. I overflow your CPU. What are you going to do with that? So in this negotiation, I could not get away from what the object was giving me. So I could either decide to use it or to drop the piece. So by deciding to use, and that's the other point of the discussion, I was going to say that indirectly, but in this case, it's pretty directly. The object, the technology, was steering away what I could do with the piece. So it was actively composing the piece with me because it was making decisions for me. It was making decisions for me, and it was imposing those decisions on me. I could not have my CPU overflown by the piece of code that I was using. At least not in that situation of, writing a few lines of code to play in a live context, and not in the context of I'm going to spend 3 days optimizing my memory management. So the object was imposing that to me. And when it does that, it is actively composing with me. It's creating the piece and is deciding how the creation process is. It is steering the creation process according to its limitations, according to its will. In that sense, I think that's one example of what I mean when I say in the text things like, well, technology is an active agent that leaves an imprint, a technographical mark on the object itself when you see it in the final stage, right? So yeah, that's screen bashing. That also has a pun on the name, not as ridiculous pun as the one that Paulo mentioned. This one's a little more geeky because it has to do with the bash environment in the terminal, and I'm bashing the screen with a whole bunch of shit. But this one's a little bit more, it works a little bit better. But that's the piece, basically, in a nutshell, or maybe not in a nutshell, like in 15 minutes. If you guys have any questions or comments on what I said, so I'm not here just, babbling on for 2 hours.
Even the way, even the code for, not the code, but the result of printing on the screen. This is actually this is a quote as well from a classic code, I guess from the Commodore platform. I don't recall the name of the code.
Yeah, the 10 print.
It's the 10 print, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also in a way a found object.
Yes, what Paulo is talking about is this. This part that comes up in the corner, the bottom left, this one right here. So this one right here, because all of the other ones, what I'm calling the other ones, like all the terminal windows. Let me turn down the volume so we can just look at the image. So all of this, all this shit in the screen here, all of this is generated by the code that I wrote in the beginning, which is just a whole bunch of characters like equal signs and forward slashes being printed really fast on the screen. And it's generated by this code that I wrote. But there's a specific one that is here on the bottom left, which is this one that just appeared. That is a direct quote from, let me do this in Firefox. Print Commodore. This one right here is one of the, I don't know if it can be considered that, but it's one of the early examples of electronic art. And it became kind of famous because it's the title of a book. There's this book called 10 Print, like this. The name of the book is this here, which is a one-liner, also written in, what is this? I think it's BASIC. Yeah,
that
Commodore
looks like
64 BASIC. Yeah. So it's a code that prints randomly a forward slash or a back, or like a forward slash or a backslash on the Commodore. It uses like the pre-ASCII, what's it called? The standardization for characters for the Commodore. So the backslash is 205 and the forward slash is 206, if I'm not mistaken. So he randomly chooses between one or the other and prints that on the screen. So it gives a little bit of a more, structured, maze-like thing. So yeah, the code itself is not a direct quote, but the idea of, well, I'm gonna print shit on the terminal and that's gonna be the visual aspect of the piece is a direct. It has been done before, and as a nod to that, I added this one in here. Because if you look closely, this one in here, I had the code pre-written and I just called it like really fast. So I didn't actually wrote it. I had it pre-written and I knew where it was, is this 1.c file. All the other codes are named A, B, C, D, and this one is just like 1.c, just because I wanted to recognize that, yeah, this is this has been done before, this type of procedure, of course. So it is a found object, not the code itself, but the idea of, well, printing stuff on the screen and that being the visual aspect of a piece.
Yeah, it's also a nod to ASCII art, I would say.
I was thinking about ASCII art and also like early visual music. I just have a comment, not so much a question, but something I quite enjoyed is that there's an economy of means to the generator of the piece. It's actually a very simple piece, and I say that
it's
as
a for loop.
Yeah, it's
basically a for loop.
It's low information and pretty complex results, and I think that's something that's actually, maybe this will make you cringe a little bit, but it's really composerly in a way. To have such an economy of means of an idea, that's the way you were saying, I think, is something that artists are very good about when exploring these things, these objects that in their more functional purposes are just, that could be more functional if done quote unquote correctly.
Yeah, but I think that connects really well. Of course, you're completely right. There's an economy of means there that is absurd and is by design. Also for the Super Collider code, like I said, if you look, there's no wrapper functions. There's no outside arguments that I can use. It's a one-liner that, just to come full circle in the found object thing, that's actually some parts of it are stolen from Super Collider tweets. There are some parts of it that use bit shifting that I literally copy and paste parts of the structure from some Super Collider tweets and wrap a whole bunch of my other stuff around it. But to come back to the visual part, there's a big economy of means. But what I think it's interesting there is, like I was saying before, it demonstrates how fundamentally different is our approaches to those technical objects when we're artists and when we're engineers. But more than that, this is the type of like this piece, and when we are doing art and technology, whatever that means, art that has technology not just as a tool, and I'm gonna go into that more on the paper, but technology as the thing itself that you speculate with, because of course a piano is a technology, a violin bow is a technology that evolved, and the evolution of the technology allowed for new music to be made. Of course, it's not just a matter of old technology or new technology, but I think it's a different thing. Well, I'll try and talk about that on the paper, but what I wanted to say about this one is that this is an example of how, when technology is the place for inquiry and itself, this piece, let me think better about the argument that I'm trying to make here. There's a certain type of art that comes from this intersection of art and technology, and this one represents that in a sense that, okay, I'm an artist, I learned what a for loop is, so I'm just gonna print stuff on the screen. Okay, but if we want to go a little bit more technical and think about actual creative processes and how they happen, oh, that's why I couldn't compile, because the screen bashing.c is not here anymore. I think I put it on the desktop. If we look, no, I didn't. Well, I don't know where I put it. Okay, so if we look at the code, there's the C code, the for loop with the printf. But if you just do this without line 11 and line 12, so without those two things here, I had it on Emacs. Oh, never mind. If we do the for loop without the f flush and the system sleep, it doesn't have this effect. You have to somehow stop the system between one print action and the other, and that's what gives the animation effect. Because if you do it without the sleep function, it's basically just the for loop going as fast as possible, and then you pretty much crash almost instantly. So that didn't work for me as a material to work and make a piece, because then the piece is done. It could be a conceptual piece. I go to one for loop and that's it, and it's done. But I wanted to make something that lasts a little bit longer. So that limitation and that thing that the object was presenting me, which was, you know what, I cannot just do a pure for loop, otherwise you crash the system in 1 second. It threw my composition process and my creation process into a technical investigation of, okay, how does the C programming work in terms of making the system stop for a little bit? And I thought to myself, well, okay, there's probably a sleep function somewhere, and I found out the sleep function. Well, it didn't work. Why not? And then I had to find somewhere this f flush std outline, which, to be honest, I am not 100% sure what it does. I know that's their standard out that prints stuff to the screen, and the name flush implies that it's somehow cleaning that pipeline before sending more stuff to the standard out. It worked, and I didn't explore more than that, because I thought that, well, for what I want here, it's not going to add anything to me. I don't need it. I don't need to go into more going into looking how the compiler for the C programming language works to understand. But it shows this very specific situation where I think a lot of us, if you've ever done any piece of music that uses a technology that you're not sure how it works, these places that we found ourselves, which is, okay, so I'm writing a piece, I'm creating art, but there's this parallel job that happens. There's this two things going together, which is I have to learn how the tool that I'm using to make art works, which is a completely different situation from I'm making a piece of music with a piano. I understand how a piano works. There's a repertoire to it. It's a familiar interface. Or even if you don't play the piano, like I don't play the bassoon, but I've written for the bassoon because I studied orchestration. So in a way, I know what is possible to do with it. I'm familiarized with its possibilities, not through a direct way. I've never played the bassoon, but potatoes. It's the same with the piano if you've already played. But it's a very specific situation that I think that happens when we're working with with art and technology, which is especially with experimental art. A lot of times you're learning how the tool works while you're making the piece, of art. And those two things go together.
Can I make a comment? It's something I was thinking about, especially with your text and this notion of the experiment, which I actually think can apply to other technologies, be it bassoons or violins. But I think it's one of the great misnomers of experimental music is this idea of the experiment, actually in the context of the experimental process, where you have a hypothesis and you prove your hypothesis right or wrong. That's the traditional scientific process. And actually, where I think musicians and artists are really good at pushing things forward is not to have an hypothesis and to then continue with the experiment. And it doesn't matter where you're right or wrong with respect to your hypothesis. And actually, I think it's where there's a great, unfortunately, void that there used to be, for example, with Jim Tenney at Bell Labs. They brought him to work with scientists there. I think artists could have a real agency in the scientific process because they have the biological function of the mutant. They do things wrong, and that actually can lead to innovations, even inadvertently. And that is, by definition, how we've come to learn, for example, Darwinian evolution is these things that cause mutations. And I would say that artists are, in a way, active agents in that process by doing things in ways that don't, that forego the scientific process as we know it in the realm of science and mathematics. And so that's something that I really was thinking about when reading your text and also hearing you talk, is that there's also this really beautiful agency of the artists as the one who bastardizes the pantheon of the scientific process.
I actually have a comment on that. I totally agree. There is a text by Gaston Bachelard, if I'm not mistaken, that I really enjoy called, I don't know if the translation to English is exactly that, but I'll try to explain. Surrationalism, something that goes under the level of rationalism. There is a parallel with subconscious, in which Bachelard would say kind of what you just said, that science could be done as art, which I think it's an amazing idea, actually. When you redefine the idea of experimentation inside the scientific practice, but to not an experiment as something that will prove something that you thought prior, but as something that will result somehow in something. And this is the experimentation process, not from a hypothesis, but from, I would call it a creative perspective.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that is a lot of times when we're talking about this, a lot of times it seems, and I think both of you mentioned at some point in what you just said, this idea of making it wrong or going against the grain, or artists can do it wrong, can take an object, a piece of code that would not work for a traditional program and turn it into art because we have the liberty to it. But I think there's a small subtlety to, like, I'm not advocating for a penicillin creative process, if that makes sense. As in, let's do stuff, and if we're lucky, something is gonna come out of it.
But yeah, you don't want it to be normalized. I agree. I think I didn't mean to suggest that. I just want to point out. Yeah. And actually, that's why I think the economy of means makes a big difference. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it goes back to this idea of a different mindset to the same object. And I think this is a nice segue to the next piece that I want to show in less time than we talked about screen bashing, because it's very similar in one sense. And I want to have time to go over a little bit of the paper with you guys. But the other one, which is Square Fuck, it's a live coding piece for Arduinos. And this one, I had the video on. Sorry guys, I'm a little tired already, but it's there. I had it here. Why is it not here anymore? Fuck. Extra. This one. Oh yeah, it's because it's in the overkill folder. Okay, there you go. So what's going on here is that it's a live coding piece for Arduino. And if you've ever programmed with Arduino before, you might think to yourself, like, how do you live code an Arduino? And I think this is a nice discussion to have with the whole having an hypothesis thing. But I think this is not going to work on VLC. I have to press the space bar. But just to give a little bit of context of what's going on before playing it, is I think it's on this example, I have 3 or 4 Arduino boards connected via a USB hub on the same computer. And each Arduino has, a small speaker connected directly to a digital port. So there's no extra circuitry. Imagine what you would do with a blink sketch. If you've ever programmed with Arduino, just literally positive to the digital pin, negative to ground, and that's it. And I have one of these per Arduino. So like in this example, like I said, I think I have 4. And if you send voltage like you do with an Arduino pin, 5 volts to a speaker, you send a small DC voltage and it goes, it does it. Or actually, if you keep the voltage, it stays there. But if you turn it off, it comes back, the cone comes back. And if you do that fast enough, you have sound. But it's really tiny. It's a small speaker that doesn't have an amplifier on. So I have some small inductor pickups. Yeah, just some small inductors. Just inside of the speakers, sometimes like literally like this. It's awesome. You get no feedback. You can play as loud as you want. It's amazing. And this is what's going to the PA system, and this is the sound that you hear. Okay, so this is actually just a small excerpt, so I can play the whole thing. It's like 2 or 3 minutes, but the whole piece lasts for maybe 10 or 15. I don't think you're hearing, right? Oh, yeah. Okay, so the way that this piece came to be also connects a lot with what we're discussing, because again, if you've programmed Arduinos before, you know that basically what I was doing that was the blink sketch, which is literally the first lesson that you learn on an Arduino, is the hello world of the Arduino. Just turn an LED on, use a delay function to wait for a second, turn the LED off. And it's funny because the Arduino is in this middle ground of an object that can be used to make art, but at the same time, a lot of hobbyist engineers and designers learn it. So if you go to places that exist in this, again, middle ground between art and design, like maker spaces, for example. Maker spaces are not per se artist-driven environments. So maybe you're there learning Arduino because you want to make a CNC router or a 3D printer, or you want to make something that checks the pH of the beer that you're brewing at home. There are all other use cases for Arduinos that you as a hobbyist might have an incentive to learn, that are not artist oriented. And I've seen a lot of Arduinos being taught, again, the very first thing that you do, just turn an LED on and off. An engineer might look at it and say, well, okay, this is almost, if I'm not mistaken, I think I said that in the article, the documentation for the Arduino literally says it is the simplest thing that you can do with an Arduino. So someone, an engineer might look and say, well, this is pretty much almost just to make sure that everything is working. Now the cables are working, now the serial port is connected. Let's do something, let's go to something that is actually useful for something else. But think from the perspective of a sound artist. You're turning something on and off. That is literally what sound is. You're alternating an entity between an excited state and a rest state. So that's like, that's to make that work, and not to consider that well, this is a very simple entity, but you can do a lot with it. It's maybe the equivalent of teaching, how to draw lines with a pencil, and say, well, yeah, okay, you drew lines, great. Let's go to something that, just to make sure that your pencil is working, let's go to something else. So there's an economy of means there that, from the perspective of an artist, to use your term, like the economy of means, has to be recognized and has to be acknowledged when you're using that entity, of course. But what was interesting about that, I want to talk about the limitations and how the object steers the process, was, well, I saw that and I think, okay, great, I can make sounds just connecting a speaker directly to the Arduino. I'm going to connect, and then there's the whole hypothesis thing. I'm just going to connect a whole bunch of Arduinos and open a whole bunch of Arduino IDEs and program and make a piece with it. Nice. But then I discovered that the Arduino IDE doesn't allow you to, first of all, have more than one instance of the Arduino IDE open, and you cannot have more than one Arduino selected at the same time for the serial port. So I had this problem, like, okay, so I have to change the serial port. I can have 5 Arduinos connected at the same time, but every time I want to upload the code, I have to change the serial port. So I cannot have one Arduino IDE with the background, and then another one for lead, and several layers. It has to be one continuous thing, and I have to change the serial port on the fly. And at first I thought, well, this is not going to work. It's impossible. I have to keep clicking on the menu for the serial port. But I have Paulo knows about this a little bit. I have an unhealthy relationship with keyboard shortcuts and keyboard optimization. So what happens is, yeah, like I go to great extents and now that to have the things work in a certain way, as in like having, like, this is my main keyboard, for example. It has no arrow keys and no anything written on it, but that's because I can program any key to do whatever I want. So what I figured out with this piece for the Arduino is that, okay, so apparently well, I already used that a little bit, but on this piece, it became an instrument almost. On Mac OS, you have all these menu items here at the top, file, edit, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as this Arduino IDE opens, come on. Caralho, Carlos, tu tá muito barbudo, mano.
Tá bonito?
Pô, tá bonitão. Come on, open. God damn it. Well, at some point, some menu items are going to appear here in the top, and macOS has this system where you can type to search for menu items. It is thought out for things like, imagine you have Photoshop, and then you have 20 menu items. Each one of them has 50 sub-menus, but you know that there's something called contrast somewhere in one of those, in that maze. So you can just click here on the help and search for contrast. Of course, here it's not going to have anything because the Arduino doesn't have that. But if I look for port, for the serial port, I can select the menu items with the keyboard. This is something that some Linux distributions have. They call it a heads-up display, HUD, which is very, very useful. So what happens is that's the IDE presented me with that, like, you cannot have more than one at the same time. And I said, okay, so I'm going to research this, see if I can make this work. And it works. Like, I figured out the keyboard shortcut for it. And part of the performance is, and I rehearsed that as you rehearse, like, a difficult passage of a guitar piece. Like, first having to type the name of the board, now I have to switch to the Leonardo board. Now it's not going to happen because I don't have any boards connected, but I have to select the Leonardo board, and then I have to select the port for the Leonardo board. And that became things that introduced me to things like, okay, so I cannot have more than one Arduino board with the same name for this piece to work. I have to have several boards, one Mega, one Uno, one Due, one Leonardo. I cannot use the Chinese knockoffs that I buy because their names on the serial port are like XWCT4, and that would not work. I wouldn't even be able to remember that. But in the end, it became part of the piece, and I've had comments on the performers saying things like, it's almost this comical, cliche, cyberpunkish hacking the system on a TV show type of stuff, because there's a whole bunch of stuff popping up on the screen, on the menus, and I'm not clicking on anything. But it became a very integral part of the visual aspect of the piece. And again, it goes back to the idea of that I didn't decide it. The system imposed that on me. It said, you know what? I'm not gonna let you have more than one Arduino IDE open at the same time. So if you want to have this piece made, you need to accept this. or find ways to circumvent it and to go around it. And I actually thought about that. I thought, well, the Arduino IDE is open source. I can try and recompile it and see if it allows me to have more than one instance. And I started looking into that. But there are other like social aspects. For example, I had to get the piece done for the conference, and I said, I'm not going to have time to go into that right now and try to rewrite my own Arduino IDE that allows for several instances. So I chose a different path. But yeah, I think it's enough from this piece to show. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that or
I just want to drop a name of a group that I don't know if they're still doing stuff, but I really like this. Seems to have some intersection with it. It's a group called Loud Objects.
Loud Objects.
Yeah, they do live soldering, live circuit soldering.
Yeah, I don't know the name, but I've been very involved with the live coding community here especially since I moved here to Europe. So there's this conference called the International Conference in Live Coding, the ICLC. I've been going to it pretty much every year for the last 4 years. This piece was actually played. I played on the one last year, and it was in Madrid. Yeah, it was 2019, which is kind of funny because a lot of people associate me with live coding. I have one piece that I write per year for that conference, but one of the reason I'm bringing the conference is that there was a big discussion on, and I've been involved in things like peer reviewing submissions to that conference for the last 2 or 3 years now. And there was a big discussion in the last 2 years of the concept of live coding, as in things like that. Is for example, a modular synthesizer that you're in real time changing the parameters or changing the patch cables, live coding? Well, it is, but it's not. There's no code. Okay, but we've had live coding performances that didn't have typed code, but had, like you mentioned, real-time circuit construction, which is something that at the conference we welcome all the time. Hardware embedded into software, hardware extending the live coding experiment. So what's the difference if you're soldering the resistor in real time, or if you're unplugging the cable from maths into clouds, from one module into the other? But yeah, there's a, and then the discussion goes into, well, but the thing with live coding is not actually the code, it's showing the process. But then if you just put a webcam and show that you're tweaking the knobs, is that the same as just opening up code that has already been written and changing the parameters of functions that are pre-written? How is that different from showing Ableton Live and just twisting the knobs? We have parameters and you're changing values for it. But yeah, there's a lot of I mean, not a lot. There's not a lot of people doing live coding. There's even a smaller amount of people doing hardware in live coding. And this piece actually started with an attempt to do live soldering on the piece, but it became this that I just showed. But I've been experimenting with creating circuits in real time and soldering in real time for, I think it's live coding. That's the community has to decide if it is or if it isn't.
That's a tough one. I've seen a few live coding with capital L performances that I am just all they're really doing is tweaking parameters. But then I've seen people really code from scratch, and I always think about this group who I remember seeing years really before live coding was in the common speak of technology. And there was really, I think they did something that epitomized it in a really nice way. and I can't put my finger on it exactly, but it has something to do with, starting from scratch, not knowing exactly how things are going to work, and demonstrating what the process in real time of creating something. And I have to admit, these live coding performances that I see, to be a harsh critic, where it's really just, people programming a knob in real time, doesn't quite epitomize it for me like those earlier performances by Loud Objects or live coding performances that I've seen that are more effective.
Yeah, to be honest, starting from scratch thing can be can be almost considered a node, if we can talk in those terms, like a node live coding practice, as in how do I say? Tipo, live code de raiz. How do I translate this? It's like in the old days. It would be like a nodey type of thing.
Because I see. Well, that shows my ignorance of the live coding community.
No, and it's funny because the two pieces that I show that I do both of them from scratch. But I think that's, well, first of all, I'm not someone that's been doing live coding for 10, 15 years, like most of the people a lot of the people from the scene. But also because I think it's a nice argument on it's a nice comment on the whole argument that we've been having in the economy of means. Like, I can program a for loop in real code. I can program a blink sketch in real code, and that has happened. I've seen a few of those performances. A lot of times, if you're not using something that is really simple, the first 2 or 3, sometimes 4 minutes of the piece is basically silent, because the guy's writing a whole bunch of stuff.
So effective about Loud Objects. Sorry to interrupt. It's just like they're sitting there soldering, and you're like sitting in silence for 5 minutes, and then all of a sudden sound comes in. You're like, fuck yeah.
Yeah. But nowadays, if you go to the conference in the last few years, like, hardly anyone starts from scratch. It's really rare. People would open new tabs, and they have boilerplate. They don't have that 4 or 5 minutes of silence, especially because if you're in a algo rave environment where people are dancing, you need to have a certain you cannot drop the ball and have people leave the dance floor. So you have some boilerplate already pre-written. But people will write a lot of code from scratch. That's for sure. Even if they start with something that is pre-written, they will write a lot of code during the performance. That still happens. But like I did it, starting from scratch, like I said, is almost a old school way of doing it.
I'm an old guy. I think there's, again, maybe these subtle distinctions are hard to define. But another thing is this idea of, for me, not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So I guess I might not like someone who's a really seasoned live coder, because then they would just start typing away and start creating, very accessible stuff immediately. I like the possibility that maybe they never make that connection, that all you get is silence or something like that. But that's just my,
well, this piece that I just showed, it works by having very small number of values for the delay function. So you turn on and you delay for 1 second, then you turn it off. And so you, again, driving the processor to the limit. And in the middle of that, I'm like changing serial ports, and serial ports are like this, like hellish entities that break, and when they stop working, they really stop working. So I had it happen to me exactly with this performance on last year's live coding conference in Madrid. Well, I was asking for it because when you do things like delay -1 while you're at the same time printing the serial port, shit happens, So it has happened exactly with me with this performance, where the serial port just gave up and it wouldn't upload anymore. And it's bizarre because the sound doesn't stop because the code has already been uploaded to the other Arduino boards. So you have that sound that is going to stay there forever. You just cannot upload it anymore, anything new. So I basically just had to say to everybody, like, yep, that's it. And just pull the plug because the serial port didn't work.
Yeah, I like when things reveal themselves like that. You know, one thing, for example, which you get a lot of at these, you know, concerts where they use technology, if something doesn't work, so then they have to come out and apologize to the audience. I always find that a little annoying. I just like, that's great that it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, this is a very personal comment, but it's something that I do with I noticed that I do with a lot of my processes, of my pieces, which is just creating an entity, creating this system, and managing the system. So somehow I create a system that has a life of its own, and for some reason, I like to create systems that throw curveballs at me the whole time. And my job as a composer is to develop the system. My job as a performer is to manage the system in real time. So it's, but that's a very personal thing. You know, I create a thing that, you know, crashes the CPU, or that, you know, you ask your delay function to basically go back in time, because that's what delay -1 means. Like, go back in time. Of course, you're walking a thin line of you know, shit is going to happen. You're asking for it, but that's a very personal thing.
Yeah, again, just to share a personal anecdote, I used to have a good friend who unfortunately has passed away. His name's Chris Wolfson, and this guy was really a wonderful coder, and he did this piece called Live Score, which is really one of the early animated notation pieces, as far as I know. And, you know, it was amazing code back then, still is now. But the way he managed to, even though he was a nervous wreck whenever he was setting it up, is that when the code bombed, the piece was over, you know?
Yeah.
And that's always such a, that idea that it's got a life of its own and it determines itself as its own agent, you know, when it ends, is something I find quite attractive.
Yeah, there's a side comment to that. It's not really the main topic that I wanted to talk about, but it's always interesting, which is how much it influences the performance, or the, you know, the ritual, when the people who are watching know what you're talking about, in a sense. Like, how a specialized audience contributes to the experience. Because those two performances that I just showed, of course, when I played them at the, you know, conference for live coding, there's like people there who are there for that. They're on the edge of their seats the whole time, like, oh, this is gonna go bad, this is gonna go bad, this is gonna go bad. You know, it's because they know that that I'm walking really near the edge of things breaking. But I've performed like the Screen Bashing, the first one. I've performed it on, you know, just a normal experimental music venue. Like, I played it a couple of times, and it's a completely different reaction. You know, people are like, oh yeah, it's visually beautiful, and there's this sound and stuff, and maybe there's like one guy who comes up like, oh, there was a mistake in that for loop, right? It's like, oh yeah, there was. So it's a different relation to the thing, but they don't grasp the walking on thin ice of the piece, which is completely fine. It's just one of the aspects of it, but it's funny how that makes a difference. Like, when the specialized audience can grasp the several minute aspects of the thing. Yeah,
I have some comments on that,
Yeah.
or questions also. I'll just throw them, and you tell me something. We have very different mindsets here watching the seminars today concerning this very topic of how much control do you have over the situations in which you put yourself in. I know that usually I This is not true, actually. There are some occasions in which I prepare myself like a lot to do things. And there are situations in which I would just throw myself in an insane project in which I have no control about anything. But even this no control thing is designed. I knew for a fact that for some projects of mine, okay, so if you propose that, what you end with is a situation in which you're gonna suffer. Like this idea of you have to get out of this situation somehow. This idea of yours of putting yourself in situations in which you will have to bat curved balls, for instance. How do you design that? This is something that I think it's interesting. How, if you have like ideas to design contexts in which you know that you will have, like, you are searching for trouble. How do you design that? This is actually a question which is also a good question for Carlos to talk about, because his project is about that as well. You know, allowing mistakes, if this is the correct word, to be a part, to relate with that in performance, and to accept the results. But I think there is a contradiction in there. I mean, it's just, I don't even know if this is a precise question. It's just an idea. If you can comment on that.
I want to make an addition to this question. It's because, like, for example, it was common, I don't know if it is common nowadays, but it was common to say that, for example, to use no input was like a dive into the unknown, or like use error in the soundboard, sound mixer, etc. But it's very clear for anyone who played no input that you have to make several strategies and effort to make it go wild. Like, it easily goes like an instrument. So I wanted also a comment upon this, because people tend to stress how uncontrollable some of these types of interactions with the hardware or software are, but sometimes it's a very controlled non-control, like, and like an instrument has this also, if you're looking for the wolf tone or etc.
Yeah, it's well, I can try and answer it from my point of view, but a part of the answer depends on redefining what control is. So I can answer with another question, which is, like, for example, for the screen bashing, the first one, there's a very controlled environment where I write code that I know how it's going to behave, and I know that as soon as I put maybe 6 or 7 after like the 7th process running at the same time, I start to having less and less control of the computer, in the sense that I move my mouse and the mouse doesn't move anymore. So, and I know that I'm gonna perform this piece because I rehearsed it, and that it lasts around 15 minutes for me to lose control completely of the computer. So that is a very, very controlled situation, actually. And the second step, which is how the piece exists today, it actually adds a more contradictional level of control and lack of control, which is I know that if I start a piece with around 20% battery, it lasts for 15 minutes or something like that. So it might seem like, well, it's completely out of control, but no, if there's a certain thing that's going to happen is that the piece is going to end when the battery dies. So it's completely predictable in that sense. So yeah, it's designing the system in a way that I am completely certain of how some inputs are going to behave, or at least I think one way to think about it is in terms of levels. Like on a macro level is really control, but on the macro level, but on the micro and the micro level, there are a lot of uncertainties, especially on the Arduino one, like with the serial port. Like for example, on the Arduino one, there's this thing, I have no idea why it happens, that one Arduino, when I'm performing this piece, that one of the Arduinos steals the name from another one. So even though I have like a Leonardo, Uno, and a Mega, I will somehow have 2 Megas. But it was a bug that was so present that I started to understand how it worked. And I knew, okay, the second Mega is actually the Leonardo, because I rehearsed it so much and I knew the system so much that I knew how it happened. Or I knew how far I could push the serial port before it would crash. So
yeah, you just go on like adapting.
Exactly.
You can learn also
and that's the thing, that you keep on adapting, or you decide to just not use that. Like I said, for the screen bashing, if I don't sleep the system, it crashes in 1 second. It's the same thing with the serial port on the Arduino. There are a couple of situations where I know that I crash instantly, and then the piece lasts for 30 seconds. I don't want that. So I abandon that and I work around it.
So if I can add something, just to that, it's just that basically when you're dealing with like the potential for failure in technological art, let's put it this way, what happens normally is that that strategy that Paulo asked is normally developed through trial and error, just as you would discover one of those failures in order for you to exploit it. So it's basically from messing around. Since you're considering like you're building a system that's gonna be chaotic and behave in unexpected ways, what you can do to make it like more predictable is basically to exploit it more and try it out and see which are the different approaches you can have to it. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I wanted, can I add on top of your addition, which is, I mean, and back to both the question from Enrique Paulo, it's one thing that I think is kind of interesting, and again, often something I find unsatisfying in no input mixer situations is when people really know what's going on, that there is no chaotic circuit there. And so I think people who I like who do a no input mixer, who are like, as Carlos was saying, is that they're really good at finding chaotic circuits, which is actually insanely hard. To design a truly chaotic function is really difficult. And in fact, also, if you look at it in a strictly theoretical point of view, finding a program that doesn't just quickly go into a loop is also extremely hard. The number of noisy programs is substantial, just a small fraction of the total space of all programs. So I think what's kind of interesting about people who I enjoy seeing is that they kind of have an intuition on how to find those things, how to limit that domain to where they can actually get into real chaotic situations.
Yeah, and I think this is a common subject among, going back a little bit to that idea that you're learning how you're building a system at the same time that you're writing the piece. You're learning how the system behaves at the same time that you're writing the piece. I think it's a common theme where, okay, it's the beginning of the process. I don't know how this works yet, but you spend so much time with it that eventually you learn. So the argument that I made with well, this is the piano, this is how it works, you've been playing it for 15 years, there's a lot of certainty of how it behaves. Whereas if you have, there's no school of performers for a piezo disc on a piece of metal through a distortion pedal. Well, actually, this was a horrible example, but there's no school of performers for live coding an Arduino with a speaker. But after a while, you played so much with the system, it becomes an instrument. I have this the same anecdote from a friend of ours, André Damião, which is an awesome composer that also builds this instruments with electronics. And he built this instrument, which was a TV, the small 5-inch TVs that he found in the trash. He just put a whole bunch of Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and instruments on it. And it was really chaotic at first, he didn't know how it worked. But after playing with it for a year, he said, oh, this has become my instrument. I've been playing for a year, and I know how it works. I know how it behaves. I know how the tuning system for the channel influences the harmonic content of the audio. So in a certain way, you lose that for sure. You lose that uncertainty of not knowing how the system behaves, and then you build something else if that's what you're looking for in a performance situation.
Yeah, I mean, again, I keep thinking about these analogies to evolution. Well, what was once novel becomes, normalized. Innovation is not a permanent thing, and innovation is not a permanent thing.
Your analogy is way more serious than the analogy I thought while hearing this whole topic. I thought about how Suicidal Tendencies, the band, was so interesting at the beginning, when only the guitar player could play really well and the rest of the band maybe not. But they ended up being this super virtuoso band, and it for me, it was not just a sorry if you were anyhow watching this video, the members of the band. It's just my opinion. It's not so interesting as the beginning of their
yeah, but another a more interesting example perhaps is the Shags. This is a wonderful band, whose father thought they were great, and they are great, but not he thought that they were going to be traditional rock stars, but the reason they're so great is that they actually didn't have this traditional training, and so they made this really weird, wild music because they assumed really strange things from the outset. It's a really strange example.
And also, Michael, they actually released stuff after the first album. And of course, they learned a bit how to play, and it's boring.
Yeah. Oh, I guess I haven't heard that. Damn. That's it. See, we need to keep a sense of perpetual innocence and lack of specialization. I think this is one thing that keeps coming up.
As funny as those examples are, like the Shags and the Suicidal Tendencies one is because one might think okay, how do we keep that? How do you play with a band for 20 years and not learn your instrument? And I think that's a very good indicative of why we build our own instruments and why we build stuff and why we create electronic circuits or new code, or because somehow when your process is driven by discovering how the technical entity works, you have to have an object that you don't know how it works in the beginning. Or maybe it's the other way around. In other words, if your composition process, if your creation process is shared with the technology device, with the technical device, in the sense that it has agency and it's proposing for you things, and in that process, it is showing its boundaries and how it dictates you can go here, but you cannot go there. You can only do that with an entity that you don't know how it works completely. It's really hard to do that with an instrument that you've been playing for 20 years, I think.
Yeah, and I think most people don't get out of that. I mean, someone who I really care about and whose music I still love, even the music that they're writing today, is Alvin Lucier, for example. And Alvin Lucier, you know, who once was really the quintessential experimentalist, and that he really had no idea. I mean, if you hear him talk about, you know, music for solo performer, he's like, I knew a guy who had a brainwave machine, and I stuck some transducers to some percussion objects. But now he is doing these pieces that are like, I'm sitting in a room, but with orchestras and things like that, and they're still very beautiful pieces, but he didn't build the next instrument. And so it's a really hard thing to keep doing. And I think that's why people really form often an aesthetic that then perpetuates, that they really become very mature in their later years, which is also fine. I mean, I'm not. It's not a critique. It's just pointing out that it is very hard to do what you're saying. And I think you're right. Your conclusion about that's why you build new instruments or you try different algorithms is a very valid one.
Yeah, it comes back to the idea of agency. If your creative process is shared with an entity over which you have complete control, it's completely different from it's like having a bandmate that does everything that you tell him to. You know, it's to build up on the horrible examples. You know, it's like it's why you're never gonna see a very innovative bass line on a Ingi Malmsteen album. You know, it's an entity on that process that has zero saying on the outcome. So
yeah, we are stretching the mark of bad examples.
Yeah, let's push the envelope here, like to the extreme. But the point is valid, right? It's
absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
it makes total sense. And it's the trap is not the right word, but it is what most people do is they don't get out of that. They just become more. Yeah, they just explore what they know in more depths. They become the virtuoso, you know, in the traditional sense.
It reminds me also to bring another example out of, in a way, out of our scope. It reminds me of two things, actually. One is a movie called Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which is about Jiro, the Japanese renowned 3 stars Michelin cook of sushi, which spent his whole life refining the finest details of what he went on to do, like from the knife which he used, to the temperature of the knife, to the temperature of the water, to the temperature of, which is related to what Mike said, maybe, of building an aesthetics and then really going into it until like it's like a process of going inner, like in discovering the undiscovered corners of what you've been doing, and then occupying this, and so on. Another thing that comes to my mind is that usually people in these scenes in which I go through here in Brazil, there are some people who sign different projects with different properties, with different interests. So you have like different names for different areas of interest. And this could also relate to what we've been, this could be like a sort of a middle ground between.
Well, yeah, I'm not middle ground. Maybe not is not what it is. I think what it is, and what I'm allergic to. Sorry to keep bringing this up. It's just really on my mind. You know, we're in the age of the specialist, which I find highly problematic. But that's not without, you know, the idea that you can really. I think Magno said it earlier. You really can provide focus. You can provide scope, and you can peer into this very, very narrow window to then only find this great expanse. That those things are actually very different. I just want to clarify that my notion of the specialist is different than, say, someone who can define really extreme limits just to create a whole another universe that is quite expansive. Again, a wonderful example of that in my mind is always Phil Niblock. You know, on the surface, looks like he's doing the same thing for 40 years, but actually what you're realizing is he's like a kid in an enormous playground, but that playground from a certain distance, you know, it looks really, really small.
Yeah, another dimension of this idea of the specialist that has to deal with this. We were talking about control and not having control, and you know, someone mentioned the virtuoso several times. That the live coding piece that I did with the Arduinos, like I mentioned, I have this unhealthy relationship with keyboard shortcuts. And when the new macOS version came out, they changed the keyboard shortcut for that pop-up menu. So that changed the way that I can play. And now that I'm pretty much using Linux all the time, I still haven't been able to put on Linux the exact configuration of, for example, the arrow keys where I like them on the keyboard, and how do I jump the cursor from word to word or from sentence to sentence. It's different from what I have, like several years of memory, muscle memory from macOS. In Linux now it's different. And in Linux, I don't have the heads-up display. So what I'm trying to say is, like, well, first of all, I cannot play that piece on Linux right now. But what I'm trying to say is that there's an aspect of virtuosity and becoming a specialist in this device that it's unknown, and it's part of the process. You know, you're building the thing, you don't know how it works, and then you, like Paulo said, you go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you see something and you occupy that space, and you see a possibility and you occupy that space. And until you're comfortable with the thing becoming your life for 60 years, like making the sushi, or becoming this performance that once you know how the system works to a certain extent, you lose interest in, and you build a new system. So.
It's a fine line. I actually had a question about that just for you, is how do you see these pieces living? Do they live and die with you? I mean, is there a longevity? This is a difficult question with technology, you know, and respect to legacy and how things live on. You know, you clearly document these things. It's really a change in subject, so just swipe it under the rug if you don't want to go that direction.
No, it's
I think curious I was about in your work.
But you mean in terms of preserving for other people to play it, or for me to be able to play it again, or both, or whatever?
Both. You know, but the question also is as well, that's why I said, does it live and die with you, which a lot of pieces do live and die with them, or they're kind of like this fine line where you have this documentation like Robert Ashley operas, you know, which you really can only know how to do if you've seen the Robert Ashley troupe.
Well, in terms of documentation for other people, there's a pragmatic aspect of, and I've had several discussions about this with my ex-girlfriend, which is a curator for digital arts, specialized in web art from the 90s. So you imagine how much she has a special opinion about knowing how to document properly your stuff, like web art from the 90s that you cannot access it anymore. So there's a pragmatic aspect that I don't have. I don't have time for it, as in making a proper documentation that someone can, 30 years from now look and reconstruct the piece. I have the code. I have it on my website, and that's it. It's that's it. There's a circuit to it. There's a schematic there. Those are things that are well documented. Circuit diagram is a circuit diagram 40 years ago, and I hope 50 years from now it's going to be the same.
But you don't document the performance practice.
But yeah, that's the other thing. Like for the performance itself, again, pragmatic aspect. I like to document because I want to have documentation of my work, as in having a website where people can say, "Oh, you're a guy who does this. I'm gonna call you to do a gig." That's my main concern in terms of documenting stuff right now and in the last 2 years. It might change completely a year from now. But the other aspect, which I think is more interesting, which is, am I going to be able to play these pieces 5 years from now, 10 years from now? There is absolutely no other way of thinking about it other than go open source. That's it.
Yeah, that seems so clear to me.
Yeah,
never to use a proprietary piece of software ever.
Yeah, there's a talk from Miller Puquette on. It's one of those, aula magna, beginning of the semester in some university, I don't know where it is, where he talks about using proprietary software and how you shouldn't do it for arts, but the way he says it, it's almost as the way that I say it now is like, yeah, if you wanna be sure that you're not gonna be able to play your piece 5 years from now, use Maxim SP or Ableton Live, or actually in this talk he says something like, he asked for someone in the audience, like, what's the other one, the other software that people are using with Max? So, oh, Ableton Live. Oh yeah, that one, Ableton Live. And then become like a running joke with the guys from the music computer department at the University of São Paulo, where I studied at the time. It became like the Ableton Live was like that software that the young guys are using now. What is it called? But it's there. Like if you use something, if you have a piece that uses both of them, you're for sure not be able to play it 5 or 10 years from now. So and that's one of the reasons that in the last year I pretty much migrated to Linux as much as I can, and that gives me, I migrated from Maxim SP to Super Collider. I migrated from this to the other, because at least I have pieces that I made in Maxim SP 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that I don't have a way to play it anymore. And I think that the ones that I'm writing now with Super Collider or Sonic Pi or whatever, I'm still going to be able to play it 10 years from now, even if I have to have, a virtual machine with an old version of Linux because the new version of Super Collider doesn't run 32 bits anymore. I don't know, but it's still going to be there somehow. So,
but again, what I think it's, and this could be just a fantasy, right? What I think people like you and Enrique do is actually involved with it's like you're preparing your body and mind to keep on doing work. So if there is like a huge paradigmatic shift to, I don't know, to quantum computing, and you have to adapt to a completely different paradigm. What I think, I don't know if you are concerned with legacy, right? what I want to say, and that is kind of what I meant in my introduction with the idea of being a survival, is that okay, I'll do something else. Okay, I'll just do something else. Let me think about another work. I don't know.
In a sense, yes. I think I can relate to what you're saying. You know, you're someone who knows me in some certain aspects quite well, and I agree with that. It doesn't mean I'm happy about it. Like, to give again a very specific example, I've been using macOS for like 10 years. I had a system that was insanely well, you know, it worked really well. I had, you know, fuzzy finding for everything in my computer. I could find any file that I had no idea where it is and open with any program that was not the default program, and navigate files like with 4 keystrokes, things that would take, and do it in 5 seconds, things that would take, you know, 20 mouse clicks and 2 minutes to other people. And I loved it. It was amazing. It made me very, very efficient. Now I don't have that anymore on Linux. I'm having to start from scratch. So I'm not happy about it, because I see myself doing things.
We'll get there.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I'll get there. It implies I have to decide the system to invest in now. Because when I did it with macOS, I did it out of naivety because I was young. I had no idea that there were other options, and macOS presented me with that as a closed. I mean, this is kind of off topic, but that's how it worked, and I just took that non-conformity that macOS has, and I ran with it, and I became like super proficient with it. But now Linux is like, okay, so you can become super proficient in KDE, but the workflow for OpenBox or i3 or GNOME or whatever, or Cinnamon, is completely different. And you have to choose one, which is the one that's still going to be around 10 years from now. And then and that is something that happens with open source, which is doesn't happen that often with commercial software, is that it's a lot more fragile. Because if your system relies on a piece of software that has the buzz factor of 100, you know, is that just one developer, if he gets hit by a buzz, the program dies. If your workflow depends on that type of program, then you're in for a world of pain, because that guy can, you know, have a kid next year and he doesn't have time for your system anymore. And that happens a lot. Like, I use Emacs as my text editor. Emacs has a whole bunch of plugins and packages that some of those packages are used by a majority of the community, and they're maintained by one guy who sometimes sends emails on the mailing list like, guys, I don't have time to use this anymore. Someone please pick up the development, because things like this, like I had a kid, I don't have time anymore, you know. So you don't see that often in commercial software. So there's another side to it, right? And in my case, it's this, like, I'll get there, but right now it's like I played guitar for 20 years, but now all my frets are a little bit off. There's this extra string. The whammy bar is not where it's supposed to be, but I can do everything, but it's okay, it takes a while. So there's a certain aspect to virtuosity that comes in play here. Like I said, I rehearsed, trying to bring it back a little bit more to our topic at hand here. I rehearsed that changing the serial port via keyboard shortcuts, like I rehearsed a music piece, you know, with an instrument. So yeah, there's room for that here, I think. Paulo looks like he's about to say something, like going here and there. Like,
No, I'm not.
Maybe we should go on to the text.
yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Like, do we still have time for that? Because if it's going on for too long and it's too tiresome to start talking about Heidegger now, we just don't do the text. There's no problem. or we can do it for like 10, 15 minutes and just end it, because we've been going for like 2.5 hours already. So it's up to you guys. I'm here.
I
I
confess,
personally would like to go over the text, but
Just a little bit.
I'm kind of tired, but I could go over the text as well.
Nah.
Go on.
Okay, we'll do it quickly, just so that
apologies to throw you off that we went so long on talking about obscure bands, but it was nice to go down that route.
Yeah, but it's okay. We'll do the text really quick, just so that you all can say that I totally misunderstood Heidegger. That's completely wrong, and then we'll call it quits. So yeah, let's try and do it like this. Like I mentioned, this is one of those. This is a text that was used for applying to a PhD program. And as you might imagine, it's a text that has more questions than answers. It has a proposition of interest into a subject more than any type of conclusion on anything. But the main topic is this idea of agency, how technical objects, when they mediate art practices, they are not neutral entities, and how they are almost co-creators of the piece. So let me just close this door here really quick. So I'll read some passages, and you guys stop me at any point, and then I'll comment. So let's wing it. So this paper presents both practical and theoretical strategies for the investigation of technology mediation in the context of experimental sound-based practices. For that, terminology and methodology is proposed in order to determine how, on an object-specific basis, which is a term that I'm proposing, creative processes are impacted when technical objects become agents in art making. The notion of experimental is also themed by proposing a connection between the term experimental and Heidegger's concept of inframing, the Gestell. So, a music practice rooted in critical engagement with DIY electronics and use of programming languages as art-making devices has steered my interest academically and artistically towards technologically mediated creative processes in experimental music, which is where this research situates itself. But if all art can be considered technology mediated on some level, my focus lies specifically on aestheticized technology, technical, i.e. technical apparatuses that are taken as places for poetic speculation, objects of inquiry in a creative process, art that comes to be from and through technology, as opposed to just making use of it. So the first idea is this differentiation between what is aestheticized technology, or just because any art can be technologically mediated. A paintbrush is a technology, but there's a certain different mindset, which we've been discussing for the last 2 hours, of having the technical entity as the place for creative inquiry. That process of, like Paulo put it, that I like it very much, of finding a place and occupying it, finding a place and occupying it. Another way of saying this, which I think is what interests me, it's you could ask yourself, like, what is the point from which the process emanates? So you could say to yourself, well, yeah, when there was a new technological development on the piano, and a new pedal was developed, and now you can have a keys on the low register as sostenuto, having sustain, and the higher keys don't having sustain. So that allows you to create new harmonies that you couldn't do it before, because otherwise they will be too blurry. But the creative process is still emanates from, I'm going to create a melody, create an harmony. It's different from having the technology itself as the place from where the process emanates, if that makes sense.
I think it's a question too. I mean, I often think, well, I'm doing all these pieces that seem like I would never be able to do them without computers, but technically the concept could have been there before the technology. So I'm all often confused as to whether or not the technology is pushed by the concepts or the vice versa. I don't have an answer for it.
Yeah, well, okay, this is gonna come back. Let's move on. So this mediation has consequences for the creation process of a work, as well as the work's final form. For the form itself, one can think in terms of an enforced technographical mark, an imprint that a technical device leaves on an art object by simply being part of its creation process. Examples range from early acousmatic music, where the length of loops were a direct consequence of the physical size of the shellac discs available at the time, to the non-metric quality of most network performance music, as broadcasting latency makes it difficult for synchronicity between performance. Those are characteristics that are not present in the works as a reflex of the artist's will, but quite the opposite. They're imposed by the devices mediating the creative process. So it seems there's a form of negotiation established between apparatus and artists along and through this mediation, where the artist, by speculating creatively with the device, is presented with the terms in which that device accepts to operate. Technology then, when mediating art making, seems to show its boundaries. So this idea that, and these were two very direct, how do you call it, what's the word I'm looking for? Obvious examples, like if you listen to early acousmatic music, the length of the loops is a direct consequence of how big the disc is. You know, a more pop example that I use all the time when I'm teaching like history of phonography is the Metals album by Pink Floyd that has a track called Echoes, which is 23 minutes long. Why is it 23 minutes long? Because that's how big it could be on one side of a vinyl record. Like, it's not that they sat down to write and they said, well, this track is 23 minutes. That's so good. It's exactly how much time we have on one side of a vinyl record. It was certainly the other way around. I mean, certainly I don't have David Gilmour's phone to call, but I will bet that it was like, yeah, let's write a track that fills the whole side of the what's the biggest one that we can make? So it's 23 minutes. There's no point in making a 1 hour long track because we cannot record it. There's no way for us to record it. So it's like I said, there's this negotiation, and you can accept it or you can not accept it. As in, I don't want to make a 23-minute song. I want to make a 1 hour song. Okay, so it's just going to be played live. So the device is imposing that. It's saying you could do it, take it or leave it. It's up to you. I see this manifested in current experimental music, where there are both repertoire and practices in which what a work is, its final form, and how it comes to be, its processes, are very much associated with the technical objects those works are made with. And with that, a first broader question is presented. Is technology defining / imposing things when turned into agent in the creative process? And if so, to what extent? And with what I showed about all the two pieces and all the examples, it's pretty clear that I believe that it is. You know, it is defining a whole lot of things. Like, you cannot have more than one Arduino IDE open at the same time. You cannot have more than 5 or 6 of these processes happening at the same time without the computer crashing. So it is defining those things for you and is imposing those things. Right? Our first hypothesis might suggest that, yes, like I was saying, there's a level of unnegotiable imposition from the technical objects. A flute cannot physically reproduce 100 hertz. That's a given from the get-go, and no flute piece will ever have 100 hertz as a sonic component. So if you say, okay, I'm gonna make art with this. This is a flute. This is my object. You, from the get-go, you decided a whole bunch of stuff, or better yet, the object decided for you. One of them is you're never gonna hear 100 hertz from this object. So in this context, technology can be seen operating in a way as to inframe, and that's the translation that I found in other texts for Heidegger's concept of Gestalt. So technology seems to operate in a way as to inframe the creative processes. It locks things in place, and it delimits a zone of possible actions. And I like this idea of delimiting a zone of possible actions. Like Paulo was saying, like you have this area where you can navigate, and the technology that's mediating the process is defined. You can go up to here, no further. This frame appears to present itself not only as unnegotiable, but also as immutable, i.e. a flute will never be able to reproduce 100 hertz. So it's immutable. And object specific, i.e. other apparatuses will present different boundaries, maybe of a different complete nature. And that's kind of obvious. I'm just giving a name to it, trying to formalize it a little bit. But what a flute presents to you as poietic potential is different from a piezo microphone, right? So it's object specific. That's what I meant. So this frame, this inframing, this locking things in place, it's different from object to object that you engage with, which is completely different from, I'm Chopin, I've wrote music for piano my whole life. No, I'm Mahler, my object is the orchestra. So the boundaries are kind of similar throughout the work. You're now reconfiguring your understanding and you're engaging with the limits on an almost piece-by-piece basis, like we're discussing. At every piece, there's a new object, you create a new instrument, you create a new entity, it's a new circuit, it's a new code. You have to start from scratch this process of navigating that border and that process of learning the limits and the impositions of that entity, which I think is something that is very particular to experimental music and very particular to this practice that we've been talking about. And it shows itself very well in both programming and electronics. So those are two areas where this, I think, are very, very present, because you can make, well, yeah, let's leave it at that. But yeah, before I continue, do you have any comments or like maybe this is the part where Yuval tells me that I didn't understood Heidegger.
Yeah. I was thinking of that actually.
But just to be clear, like jokes aside, all my readings in this level of philosophy are really, really early, to the point where, okay, there's this term, I'm trying to read, secondary sources, because going straight to the first source is really complicated. At least for me, it is not something that I have I'm not very knowledgeable on. But so there's that. I'm really raw to this this subject. But go on, yeah, just
I think that you don't need to like read big books by Heidegger, but like the article that everyone reads is The Question Concerning Technology.
Yeah.
Maybe you read, because it's, and actually because Heidegger it's kind of technophobic guy, so he's telling also that the modern technology is bad, like it leads humanity to a bad view of the existence.
It's the example of the sawmill, right? The sawmill compared to the turbine engine for the power.
But the thing is that the Gestalt, the unframing, as I record, is more this kind of a priori, this pre-existing, this thing that conducts, like puts a grid into our thinking that leads us to this modern technological way of thinking. So actually, I would think that it's just about like changing this name, like you chose enframing. It makes sense, but it's for Heidegger, this is more like like putting a grid in the thinking, so you don't negotiate anymore. You just calculate. So it's more like now you're not talking more about poiesis, like because in this article there is a thing, but in technology there is something that is can be very good. That is a comeback to the poiesis stuff, and it's a bit confusing in the text, but like this is not in the same dimension as enframing. Like enframing is more like I'm going to calculate everything, going to make reservoirs.
It's the idea of a standing reserve that he said. Technology presents itself as standing reserve, which to be honest, I'm not sure if it's a statement that I fully understand yet. It's I don't grasp it quite completely, I think, but I think I see what you mean. Yeah.
What I mean is, I think you can use these kind of thinkers and thinkers that thought with Heidegger, but what you're saying is that in technology, in computation, in this kind of technology, there is also poiesis. There is also the thing that you get the union of your will to do something with the material, with the meeting of the material and you doing, and then you have to negotiate, and something emerges from it. And this is what Heidegger is praises. Like this is a way of doing things that is proper, like this.
Yeah. So maybe that
truths.
What?
But the opposite of Gesell, if I understood what you all meant with his.
Yeah, there's no grid.
Yeah, there's no grid. Yeah, it breaks the grid. Like,
but maybe that connects to the next paragraph, because this I gave because the next paragraph is the counter example, and maybe you can tell me if that's what you think. What you think, well, because the first paragraph, I'm really emphatic, like, oh, this is the well, I'm calling the frame, but it's unnegotiable, it's immutable. So it looks like I'm saying that you as a composer, as an artist, has no will in it. Technology presents itself, and that's it, and it decides. But the next example is the next paragraph. It's the counter example. So I'm not that emphatic, actually.
Before you move on, just being someone who doesn't know this particular concept of Heidegger, I completely understood what you were saying about the technology and framing stuff. So, I mean, one easy solution to deal with Enrique's criticism would just be like, just take out the Heidegger and say it's your idea. It's your idea about technology and framing. It's a perfectly clear idea, and I don't think Ewell disagreed with that. It's just what you're gonna. The problem with dealing with these, philosophical texts is that the philosophers come out of the woodwork, and even amongst themselves they can't agree. But your idea to me seemed really clear. Mm-hmm. Had I, again, not knowing that Heidegger, I was completely satisfied. So I would just chuck the Heidegger.
Yeah, but academia is that place where people know Heidegger, and if you write about technology and the limits of technology, and you use the term in framing, people, you mean in framing, but like as in Heidegger.
Well, right now you're dealing with an even worse situation, which is that they think you've misinterpreted it.
The term doesn't match.
Add a footnote. You could add a footnote. This is not Heidegger's.
This is my misinterpretation of Heidegger.
Yeah, like a footnote. I didn't fully read it. Yeah, that's totally it. solves the
This
problem.
is not Heidegger's Gestalt.
But it's an academic paper. So the footnote has to say it's outside of the scope of this research to properly define Heidegger's Gestalt.
Exactly.
Yeah, but maybe there is some comprehensive. There's this guy Hubert Dreyfus, and he's kind of a Heideggerian guy who worked with artificial intelligence, and he has like documentary, etc., about these questions related.
Yeah, I think you sent me one of his either a paper or a full book, why artificial intelligence should be more Heideggerian or something like that, right? I think at least we've talked about it.
Yeah, and the point is exactly what you're saying about this music is that if you make intelligence as lists of things to do and as pre-programmed stuff and functions and a prioris, then it doesn't function well. It has to like be in a situation and discover in the situation what to do and what to create.
So we remove the poiesis completely. Yeah. Okay, so tell me what you think about the counterexample then. Heidegger presents in framing, as I understood it, as a condition one cannot avoid its influence or sway, where an authentic relationship to technology is simply beyond our control. And there's the secondary source, Godzinski, which is a text about the question concerning technology from Heidegger. As discussed, to some extent, that's true, that this not be able to avoid its influence and whatnot. And precisely what I mean by proposing the term immutable in this context. Remember, a flute will never have 100 hertz. But a more pragmatic and just as valid argument can be made that if the artist stores his flute in a drawer to never touch it again, abandoning the investigation process, no piece will ever come to be, since the technical object here is not just a tool to an end, but the place itself from which the creation process derives. So, yeah, it's not this all-encompassing, know-it-all, can-do-it-all entity technology. I can just put the flute in a drawer and never touch it again. I bought a Raspberry Pi to make art with it. It's been sitting in my drawer for 3 months. How many people you know that? Yes, it doesn't have a mind of its own. At the end of the day, you're the one that has to pick it up and do something with it, to be, just in plain terms. So there seems to be a negotiation between technology and artists when it comes to creative practices, but also a shared agency, where artists has indeed voice in the process and technology is not an all-encompassing unanimous voice. I was quoting myself, I didn't even realize. A thought experiment can be proposed to illustrate this, where Lamont Young's composition 1960 number 7, which is the to be held for a long time 5th interval. This piece, which has no defined instrumentation, gains a for flute indication. What does it say about this device creator negotiation to be able to propose a polyphonic piece that requires ideally infinite sustain for a monophonic instrument driven by human breath? There's a long sentence, but the point is, so for the last 2 paragraphs, I was making this point that, yeah, you take the flute and it imposes things to you. One of those things is the person has to breathe. There's no infinite sustain here. You can only play one note at a time. That's how the instrument works. That's how technology presents itself to you. Well, nothing stops me from writing, and that's the question. What does it say about this device creator negotiation to take a piece like that from Lamont Young and just writing for flute on top and put it in front of someone to play? The universe is not going to collapse as in this is impossible. The rules have been broken and now the matrix, it doesn't work. No, I can write it and I can put it there and something might come out of it, right? So the frame as proposed by Heidegger, as I understood it, it's still there, but not as shackle. On the contrary, it is there as poietic potential entity, for it is exactly the artist's decision on how to navigate those boundaries that serve not only as a creative driving force, but actually make up a large portion of the experimental process. The boundary is always there, immutable, but to be engaged with. So if we project this on my pieces, it's really clear, like, you cannot have more than one Arduino IDE open, navigate around it, or just chuck it in a drawer and say that this doesn't work for what I want. I think the limitation is too big. Because navigating that, and in the process of deciding, I want to navigate this border, I want to see what I can do with, a process that locks my computer. That makes up, like I said, a large portion of the experimental process, and the work reveals itself in that process. So it's by trying to navigate the border and by trying to see where the limits of this locking in and this proposition, and trying to see how far the terms of the negotiation go. By doing that, the work reveals itself, I think, when you're thinking about experimental processes. So, yeah.
I don't know if it's only the work that I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know if it's only the work that reveals itself, but there is something that surprisingly you're not commenting, which is how the transcription process underlines the limits of the example you chose, right? You underline the limits of the flute because you're trying to transcribe something that from the beginning the flute won't by itself as we are treating the flute.
But my thought experiment was more in the case of, that was how it was composed from the get-go, not as in I'm gonna transcribe it like that for flute.
Yeah, what I meant is that what I think is interesting from this example and your transcription series is that it's not only about the sound results. It's about the exposition of the limit, this very limit with which you are struggling. And the exposition of the limit is there because of the transcription process, I would say. But this is just me thinking out loud.
I actually agree with Paolo at some extent. It seems like the idea here is also about what those limits are, and it's actually a comment that I have, which I'd be curious your opinion about, is I see two different types of limits that are being presented here, and it's your distinction between software and objects of technology. Those are two very different things to me. So, for example, these limitations that you've mentioned, like the Schlack disk or the length of a tape, are different from larger epistemological limits, which are the limits of computation given unlimited resources. Mm-hmm. And those are two really different things, both very interesting to explore. I think your work deals more so with practical limits, the limits of an object. And that seems to be a very right place for creative exploration. But I feel that there's something different about the limits of software than there are about the limits of hardware. It's the distinction,
it's even more than that, the distinction between that and like the limits of a field, because you could also you could easily append your question with something like, so what are the limits of composing with a piano? There's a lot of music that can still be made with the piano if you think of that as like I said, if you're thinking about where the point from which the thing emanates, if it is pitch class set theory to write piano music, it's different from thinking about the limits of a physical object like circuitry. But I consider a for loop an object. So from this context here, for this discussion, I could easily say, well, in screen bashing, the for loop is an object, as in it is the entity from which the process started. It's the thing that I'm inquiring to see what it gives me back and what does it show, or maybe is a bigger system of what a for loop creates with the compiling. But like it's I consider the digital objects, I consider the programming a variable might be an object. So later, I think I'm going to stop with the text. It's already getting late, but later on, there's an example with the Arduino and doing the delay in and out, on and off kind of thing, like I showed on the second piece. But going on the other extreme, like, so what is the biggest number that you can put? So what's the longest that you can turn something on and then off with an Arduino? And then the object of inquiry becomes what's the typology of a variable? And then you start to have to research as an artist what's a undefined long is, and how does that work? So the object itself becomes a variable, or better yet, the return type of a function, which is defined by a variable. So I'm sure there's a definition of object somewhere in philosophy, but it's I'm winging it, to be honest.
No, that clarifies it for me. I guess where I was finding the difference was this idea of the universality of universal Turing machines, to really put it in the machines that can compute anything computable. I think what you're talking about is like really specific instances, and I think so long as that's clarified, I don't have that issue anymore. All I'm saying is that when you talk about the limits of computing, given the universality of universal Turing machines, then you're really talking about something different than the limits of hardware. When you talk about, like, as you put it with examples such as for loops, specific instances or specific algorithms that are not universal, then that becomes much clearer for me.
Yeah. I mean, if you go the route of, if it's Turing complete, if it's the Turing machine route, then it becomes a completely different discussion. It's there's a certain practical aspect here, even with social components, like I mentioned with the Arduino one. Like, okay, the conference is in a month. My decision of engaging with the object, as in I'm going to try to recompile and change the source code of the IDE, didn't got decided because of a technical aspect, but a social one, like, I don't think I'm going to have time to do it until I have to play it. So but at the same time, it's being proposed. It doesn't change the fact that it's being proposed by the technology. So the technology is reconfiguring this network of connections between the creator, how the work is presented, even in that aspect. Like, you're proposing something that it's, well, maybe a programmer, a professional programmer would look and say, oh yeah, I can change that on the Arduino IDE in one afternoon and make it work like you want. For my case, it wasn't that. I researched for an afternoon and I thought, well, this is a little bit beyond my expertise. Is going to take a while. So, but it doesn't change the fact that it was, it emerged from something that the mediating object imposed. But yeah, if you go to the Turing way, they're like, I think I've seen on YouTube videos of things like proving that PowerPoint is a Turing complete language. So
and forgive me, and for me, this is something that I've always been extremely interested in. So it's I might be taking this places where your average a reader who's not interested in the space of all software spaces in the space of computability, they wouldn't even come to that they wouldn't even need that distinction, but it did come to my mind being.
But I think there's a place. I think there's a
fascinated by
place for that for sure in this discussion, which I haven't thought. There's a place for that, like, and it's not that far from the arts. Like, if you the first example that comes to mind, if you read the first text about computer music and synthesis, which is, well, we've done a sine wave, awesome. Now theoretically we can do any sound imaginable by man. Because of FFT, if we can do one sine wave, we can do any sound imaginable by man. But up until now, we can only do one sine wave. But in theory, we can do any sound possible imaginable by man. So there's of course, I think there's a place for that I hadn't considered. Yeah.
Then I'm not completely worthless.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's enough, guys. I don't think we should continue on. I go on to like definitions of experimental, but it's I think everything that is in here, it's been said and touched upon at some level with the first part of the examples of the pieces. So, and it's getting late. Paulo looks very, very tired.
No, I'm not. Not very,
Thank
very
you.
tired.
That was really great. Thank you.
Just one final comment is that
Yeah.
We are looking at the limits of a object, but also it seems the thing goes both ways as well, because once you're trying to deal with the limits of a object, you start researching things and that exposes your limits as well, because you're trying to negotiate eventually with objects that are completely out of your original scope. So it's like you're kind of building a relationship of growth, and it goes both ways. You're trying to stretch the uses of something, and this something stretches your limits as well.
That's what I was trying to say. Paulo's saying it much better than I was. Is that, yeah? It's like, okay, now you've got these tools where you can, the sky's the limit, so to speak, where you're not where things feel less imposed in a way.
Yeah, I can say it from a personal perspective. I don't know how that works for other people, but Paulo, you use the word scope at some point, like you decide, oh, I'm going, deeper and deeper and deeper. This is outside of the scope of what I wanted to do, of what I want to do originally. So, researching the best fish, it's into the scope, but researching the temperature of the water, it's outside of the scope. In my case particularly, and I'm thinking about this maybe for the first time, but I think it has a direct connection with the fields that I invest myself in, which are mainly programming and electronics. Usually I stop going downwards towards the infinite, but I stop, it's a downward spiral that never stops. But what makes me stop is, well, I really don't understand what's going on here, like at all. So maybe I should stop. So there's a limit, that there's this uncomfortable feeling of I completely lost grasp of what's happening. There's an area right before it, which is an amazing one, which is, okay, I have a foot in a place that I can still understand a lot of things, and I can make connections with this one that I don't fully understand, and like you mentioned, it's a growth scenario. I'm stretching farther and farther and farther, but at some point, you just stopped understanding everything. At least for me, I just stopped understanding. Like, okay, this. I don't want to get I don't want to have to do a computer science bachelor to write this piece. Or, for example, I think about a few pieces, none of them that I showed you here, but I have a few pieces that I use magnets, for example, on the guitar, with the e-bows, and not just magnets, but electromagnetic fields, batteries with copper wires. And if you research electromagnetic fields, you can easily, and I mentioned, like, at some point you stop understanding things. I made it sound like it's something really far. But with electromagnetic fields, you're like 2 clicks away on Wikipedia from going into quantum physics. So at some point, yeah.
Nowadays, what makes me feel more comfortable with such an obstacle is that I am not building a bridge, or I am not like a surgeon, So the definition of understanding for me could go on. Okay, I found a barrier, so I'll just play by ear. I'll just imagine a fiction that explains to me locally what this thing could be. And I'm dealing with an engineering concept, for instance. This is something which I find actually, which I find great, like to be able to understand understanding as a place for creation as well.
Yeah, but to configure the notion of understanding is key here. Like on the example of the screen bashing code, there's that line, the F flush std out. I know that in my code, that's the thing that makes the current character to be erased and a new one to come back. But I don't understand what it does in a more depth than this one sentence that I just said, right? So in a sense, I understand what it does. I know the function that it serves, like you said, locally on this use case, but I cannot give you one extra example of how that thing would be used, because the only time I've seen it in my entire life is that one use case. But it's for that use case, it's enough. So I understand it in that localized context, like you said. So yeah, to reconfigure understanding, the notion of understanding, I think is key here, for sure.
And as a final disclaimer of mine, even because I know there are different mindsets here, as I said before, this is not to diminish the value of sticking to a concept and trying to fulfill it in the most adequate way possible. I mean, when
the distinctions are subtle.
It could be like building a bridge if you are dealing seriously with a concept. I just think this is not necessary. I don't know if I'm making my point here, but okay, this is okay for me as well.
I realized though that I was saying something different. For example, to do it, you have an idea, and that idea seems really impossible without, say, for example, a computer. Well, now this technology comes along, and it is possible. Like, I'll give a trivial example that may have no artistic meaning or value in and of itself, but like generating all permutations of some large set. That's a really awful thing, tedious thing to do by hand, but something that's really opens up a new world of musical possibilities, so to speak, if you can compute it now that you can compute it with some relative efficiency. That's the type of opening up that I was saying about the chicken or the egg. I'm not sure whether these ideas you could find back in Leibniz. Leibniz didn't necessarily have computers, but he thought about computers.
It's more like, oh, now I can do it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there, maybe the idea does come first. I'm not sure. I just don't know. It's just an interesting thing, and it might be completely apart from what you're talking about. It might be out of scope of what you're doing, but that's something that does come to my mind about, again, when practical limits are far
Answer me up to now.
Live streaming is on.
Sorry.
He will. It's no problem. I think he will answer, and I'll let you know.
Okay. So then we'll let everybody know what we're doing next week, and then the following week we'll probably also have someone. And we are inviting people to give us thoughts about their participation in the. So feel free to, if you have any thoughts, pass them to us. We might include them in this paper we're working on, upon approval by you guys.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it would be great if you could just write a line or two about what you have been experiencing here.
But what are you guys interested in like what are you looking at in the paper? Like it's
actually, now I will stop the recording because this does not need to go on the recording. But thank you, Magno. I'm sorry, I got the live stream going, which I shouldn't have because it was antithetical to the thesis.
Okay.
So I apologize.
Yeah, Magno, so I'd like to thank you for today's session. It's been a pleasure. It was great.
Thank you for inviting. It was like I said, it was very useful for me in the sense that it's a bunch of people that I value very much the opinion, talking about something that I'm gonna have to talk about in front of a bunch of people that I don't know in a few weeks to decide if they give me a PhD or not. So it's very, very well timed.
We will put it in the article if you get it. Our seminar.
Yeah.
God, Magno.
Positive points or negative points.
But yeah, it was great.